Good evening. I'm Karen Taylor, Programme Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen. I am delighted to welcome both our in-person and online audience to tonight's talk. Servant of Beauty, Landmarks, Secret Love, and the Unimagined Life of an Unsung New York Hero. This will be a conversation with the author of Servant of Beauty, Anthony Wood, and New York Landmarks Conservancy President, Peg Breen. And it's, of course, all about Albert Bard. I am so pleased that they can both be here this evening. I also want to mention that Servant of Beauty happens to be available for purchase tonight from Suzanne, from Books on Call, and Suzanne is at the other end of the room for our in-person audience, and it's also available online through Bloomsbury Publishing. We host tonight's programme in partnership with the New York Landmarks Conservancy and the New York Preservation Archive Project. I would like to express our thanks to both organizations for all their help. I would also like to thank Thomas Donahue, our artistic window curator, for creating a special window celebrating tonight's talk and all about, of course, Albert Bard. For those of you who are less familiar with the General Society, a brief introduction. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York is a non-profit organization that was founded in 1785 by the skilled craftsmen of the City of New York. Today, our 241-year-old organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life of the people of the City of New York through our educational and cultural programs. These include our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, our John M. Mossman Lock Museum, which happens to be upstairs on the balcony above, and you're welcome to visit after tonight's talk. And, of course, the General Society Library, of which we're situated in tonight. And finally, our lecture series, which, of course, has maybe you don't know, of course, but actually has a very distinguished history and began in 1838. Tony Wood, Anthony C. Wood, is a preservationist, historian, and grant maker. He is the author of Preserving New York, Winning the Right to Protect a City's Landmarks, and Servant of Beauty, of course. Mr. Wood has worked for the New York Landmarks Preservation Commission, the Municipal Arts Society, the J.M. Kaplan Fund, and is currently the executive director of the Iselson Foundation. He is the founder and chair emeritus of the New York Preservation Archive Project. He is also past chair of the Preservation League of New York State and Partners for Sacred Places. Peg Breen joined the New York Landmarks Conservancy, one of the oldest and largest preservation organizations in the country, after careers in public television and government. She has expanded the Conservancy's advocacy, as well as loan and grant programs that help owners restore and maintain their historic buildings. She was deeply involved after 9/11 in efforts to identify and save original elements of the World Trade Center, including the survivor's staircase, which is now featured in the 9/11 Museum. Among many other things, Peg and the Conservancy are currently involved in efforts to prevent the destroying of the block south of Penn Station, which contains landmark quality buildings and middle-income apartments. And you will find full bios for both Peg and Tony on your seats tonight. Now, I am delighted to welcome Anthony Wood and Peg Breen.
Thank you for coming. Glad to see you all. And
we'll take applause. Thank you.
It's a treat for me to be able to talk to Tony about his book. You heard a lot about his background and his civic engagement, but if you read Servant of Beauty, which I encourage you to do, it is astounding to me that Albert Bard could stand up at the end of the day. I mean, he belonged to every civic group that ever existed in New York, as well as ran a law practice, as well as had an interesting secret life, which we'll talk about. But I realized that, of course, Tony would care about him, because there's nobody more civically engaged in the city than Tony.
Thank you, Dave.
So Bard was a leading preservationist and civic person of his day. Tony is of ours. So to the book. You gave Bard actually a chapter in your first book about how the Landmarks Law actually came to be. Why do you think he needed a book, a whole book?
Well, Bard is a fascinating person, and his appearance in the book that was the history of the Landmarks Law, he was one of many players, but he kept reappearing, and he became more and more interesting. In doing that book, I had heard Bard's name loosely thrown around because New York couldn't have a landmarks law without something called the Bard Act. And so I thought, well, if I figure out the Bard Act, I'll figure out why we had the law. Well, there wouldn't have been a Bard Act without Albert Bard. And so when I discovered, they weren't hidden, but when it came to my attention that Bard's papers were at the New York Public Library, I thought I'll just go over there and pick the file up on the Bard Act and it'll all become clear. Well, it turned out there were 150 boxes of his papers. And so what was supposed to be a 2-hour visit became, it was kind of what Tuesdays with Maury or whatever. It was like Saturday afternoons for a very long time. And through that research, it became clear he had a much bigger story in him than just the Bard Act.
Which you have brought out. What's interesting, as in a sense the creator of the Landmarks Law, first I was struck that someone would think, how can government legislate beauty? How can government mandate that cities should be beautiful? And I thought, what a great mind. But interestingly enough, I think what seemed to have got him going was not trying to save a building, but get rid of billboards.
Yeah. Bard hated, that's not too strong a word, hated billboards. He really felt they encroached on the public space, the space that belonged to everybody. And they were monetizing it in really dramatic ways. And so what laid the groundwork for the Bard Act was Bard was on a government committee that the mayor had appointed that issued a report in 1913 that was all focused on how to control advertising in New York City, which was taking over and going up Fifth Avenue. Just really, there are these pictures of like 2-story billboards in front of historic buildings and everything. And so Bard was put on that committee as the secretary, but he largely wrote the report. But it concluded that New York isn't going to be able to control any sort of signage unless it has the right to regulate private property on aesthetic grounds. And so in this report, he actually drafted an amendment to the Constitution of New York State that would have allowed cities to do that. Unfortunately, he was doing this in 1913, and he was literally decades ahead of his time. Though part of the great thing about Albert Bard, or one of the reasons he's such an inspiration for anyone today involved in civic work, is he dreamed up what would become the Bard Act in 1913. It didn't get passed till 1956. And Bard was not asleep during the intermittel decades. He was pushing that every opportunity he had. New York had, at that time, I'm not sure if it's still the case, every 20 years, New York decides whether it's going to have a constitutional convention. So whenever that rolled around, Bard would drag out the Bard Act, that was called the Patrimony of the People Act for a while, and try and get it passed. And finally, this is in the category of if you live long enough and you are tenacious, a dog with a bone would be an apt description of Bard. It finally happened in 1956.
Well, I found myself wondering what those early legislators thought about some guy who was worried about beauty.
Yeah.
That not a topic that came up in Albany, in the legislature very often. And so I imagine there are very few people who could grasp it as he could. And then when it finally passed the first time, the governor vetoes it and said it's too vague.
Right, and Bard, this goes back also to Bard's kind of networking abilities. So when the Bard Act went up to Albany, and it was being debated, there were all these supporting memos that various civic groups in New York prepared in supporting the Bard Act and why it was important. Of course, Bard was the one who wrote all those supporting memos because he was on all of those boards. So he was brilliantly networked and basically, kind of set the stage for that to go forward. And when it was vetoed as being too vague, his response was, it's supposed to be vague because it's enabling legislation. It would enable New York City to have a landmarks law. It wouldn't prescribe the details of the law. So finally, it came back the next year and sailed right through. I think they changed 2 words that were really, it had no change in the meaning of it. But it finally passed in 1956.
And Mayor Wagner, not knowing what to do, promptly created a commission to study what to do.
Well, there was a larger study that was going on that kind of, because people ask, well, if this Bard Act is so important, and the Bard Act passed in 1956, but we don't get our landmarks law until 1965, like, what was that all about? And what that was all about was at the same time the Bard Act passed, a guy named James Felt was made the city planning commissioner. And he decided to redo New York's zoning resolution, which was not an easy task then, and is not contemporary. It's still a problem. And so that became the focus, was this big multi-year study to redo the zoning. And the organizations that had been pushing for the Bard Act basically were told by Felt, I can't put that into the zoning. It's a heavy enough lift to get a new zoning act politically passed. But if you basically will shut up and quit harping about the need for some sort of landmark regulation, once the zoning is through, I will advance the preservation. And it was a trust me. And he was trustworthy, he delivered. So that was why there was a gap. That it took time for the new zoning to go in place, and then the action towards the law could move forward.
So as a result, Schenectady, New York beat us and became the first city in the state to have a landmarks law.
And Bard lived long enough to see that happen, but he didn't live long enough to see the landmarks law happen. He actually died. This is the eve. He died tomorrow, in 1963. So we're almost celebrating his death date.
All right, Bard led a very compartmentalized life. So let's stick with the preservation for a moment. And he had major battles with Robert Moses. Tell us about those.
So the main battles he had with Moses, who's read The Power Broker in the room? Excellent. Anyone who hasn't read The Power Broker, get up now, leave, go read it. Because it is still the really definitive book to help you understand so much of why the city looks the way it does. But anyway, in The Power Broker, there are a couple of really good chapters, and I've kind of taken those and gone a little further down into the preservation weeds. So the big battle the 2 battles were linked, but there was a proposal to build a bridge, the Brooklyn Battery Bridge, that would have gone from Brooklyn to Lower Manhattan. And everyone had assumed it was going to be a tunnel. And suddenly Moses springs it on everybody in 1939 that instead it was going to be this bridge. And this just really freaked out, if you will, the civic community, because this was really going to destroy a lot of all the supports needed in the ramps and everything. We're really going to destroy the tip of Manhattan, the historic tip of Manhattan. And so Bard was asked to be the chair of a coalition of nonprofit groups that were taking on the battle with Moses. Now, I should just point out, for any of us of a certain age in this room, Bard was 72 when he took charge of that effort. So nobody can go to a rocking chair on a porch somewhere if you care about preservation in New York. Bard was leading the fight when he was 72. But it was a great effort, and one of the reasons it's such an important story, and one of the reasons I think Bard is important, is Bard's advocacy techniques, his tactics, the strategies they used, battling Moses against the bridge, basically are pretty much what we follow today in landmark fights. And he kind of helped develop those tactics and strategies. So that was the first battle, was over the bridge. And they won that battle with what would be called the Hail Mary pass. They were all well networked. Bard was networked, the other civic leaders were networked. And even though Moses had run over them like a steamroller, they still had connections. And so the one person in America more powerful than Moses was FDR. And so through back channels, they got FDR to kill the bridge without any of his fingerprints on it publicly. His War Department needed what was supposed to be just a little sign-off that there'd be no problem. But that bridge was going over a body of water that in the case of war, our ships would need to sail through. And so they vetoed it. Now, the fact there were already several bridges that could have been bombed and blocked, it did not come into the picture. But anyway, that was ultimately how that was won. But they were fighting Moses at every level, any appeal, any process, any permit, anything that was needed, they went in and looked at opportunities to stop what would have been a really bad project.
But Moses didn't like to lose, and he took revenge. So Castle Clinton at the time was the aquarium.
Yep.
So Moses decided to destroy Castle Clinton.
Which was a beloved site. It actually had, if my memory is right, I think it had more tourists visiting it than like all the sports events in New York City at that time. It was that popular a place for the aquarium. But Moses made the case that now that he was forced, he couldn't have the bridge, so it was now going to have to be a tunnel. And Moses didn't like tunnels, but he was stuck with a tunnel. But his revenge was saying that in order for the tunnel to go through, Castle Clinton's got to go, which of course was not true. There were engineers testifying against it. So this was now another battle to stop Moses. And this was a battle that took 10 years. And the real leader of that battle was a wonderful guy named George McNamee. And Bard was kind of his lieutenant. And again, tactics that we use today, had a lawsuit that basically slowed it up. And we have to remember now we're in World War II. And so Moses has thrown out the aquarium, thrown some of the fish back in the ocean, apparently, if you believe the research, and tore down the aquarium part of Castle Clinton. But the historic walls were still there. But the walls were 10 to 12 feet thick. And Moses couldn't get the equipment to tear down the walls because the heavy equipment was needed for the war effort. And so the legal delay that had kind of stopped him from being able to do that ultimately bought the time, so ultimately Castle Clinton was saved. But so that was another example of, you know, Moses is called the power broker. And I like to think of Bard as a soft power broker, in that people followed Bard not because they were afraid of him. They followed him because he was able to pull people together and network, and just had developed over decades and decades. As Peg said, he was on so many civic boards. He was on the Fine Arts Federation, Municipal Art Society, the City Club, the Citizens Union. I mean, he was on all of those boards for 40 and 50 years. And he was a civic workhorse. He was not just on their boards, he was on like multiple committees. The guy was just, as we say, it's hard to kind of imagine that intensity, but he was passionate.
And unfortunately, it's kind of hard to imagine all of us civic groups having the connections and the influence today that they did then, too.
Different time, very, very different time. And at that time, the City Club actually had a building, I think on this block. And they had a building, they had rooms, they had restaurants, they had endless committees. So they were a hub and a center of civic activism, and Bard was at the heart of it.
What's interesting also is that for a while, civic people turned to Moses, and Bard was on panels with Moses.
Oh, yeah.
And it was a very interesting relationship.
Well, you know, Moses was a progressive early in his career. And he worked with people like Bard and McNamee and others that were involved in progressive, trying to improve New York. But at a certain point in his career, I like to say Moses went to the dark side of the force and really became, you know, a powerful person, driving projects through, not listening to input, et cetera. And so, you know, Bard went from somebody who had been working with Moses earlier in Moses' career to somebody who was now fighting Moses, but not on everything. Bard and Moses had one thing at least in common. They both hated billboards. Now, the reason Moses hated billboards was he was building these parkways, and he didn't want his beautiful parkways to be, you know, made, to be uglified by billboards. And so Bard, who's kind of number one, his bête noire was billboards. So he couldn't dismiss Moses totally because they had this shared interest. But he detested Moses's tactics, Moses's strategies. But they had kind of this cordial relationship, which is a little hard to figure out because, Moses sent like a congratulatory telegram when Bard got some award in the 50s. And Bard would occasionally he would send notes to Moses that were kind of almost, Bard had a very wicked sense of humor and a very sharp tongue. So there were these notes he would send to Moses, kind of pointing out a flaw in Moses' argument, but doing it in almost a humorous way. So it's hard to kind of fathom what was really going on with those two. The other thing that's interesting is Moses attacked anyone who was standing in his way. No matter how insignificant they were, if they were standing in his way, he went after them. And in that fight over the Brooklyn Battery Bridge, Moses went after one of Stanley Isaacs, who was another player. One of his staff people was accused of being a communist. And Moses went right after them. Of course, as some people said, what does that have to do with the bridge? But that didn't matter. I mean, Moses went for these personal attacks. At that same time, Bard had been linked to he was not a spy, but he was linked to an international spy scandal.
And we'll get to that.
With his name in the New York Times. And so the question is, why didn't Moses attack him for that? And we don't know the answer.
But speaking of spies and panels in this very interesting life and complicated life, first of all, he was a gay man in an era where you couldn't admit that. And so it was a private life.
Right, and I mean, you can't even use contemporary terms. I think he was a closeted homosexual, I think is almost a better, accurate language for what it was at that time. And it was a very different time, and his lifespan, kind of spanned from before, the Lavender Scare in the 50s, et cetera. So attitudes about that were kind of more different earlier on in the 1900s. So he kind of spanned that. And we really don't know that much about his private life, except for we know the love of his life, that a young man he was devoted to for 25 years. So he had a long-term commitment to a young man who he regarded to be, he was the emotional center of Bard's life.
Right, but that young man married a woman who Bard approved of.
Bard had known that young woman since she was 5.
So off they went to Europe, where they promptly became Russian spies. And then, I'm not quite sure how promptly, they were caught, put in separate prisons. And Bard, who was a multimillionaire.
He had been a millionaire prior to the Great Crash.
Okay, but he still had means. But spent an incredible amount of time and effort to get them out of prison and some resolve to the case.
Yeah, I mean, so it's all very complicated. They actually became involved with Soviet espionage before they went to Paris. So we have to set the stage, okay? This is the Depression, right? People are scrounging around for jobs. The horrors of the Soviet experiment weren't known yet. So people were kind of looking at it as an alternative. Capitalism was being questioned because everything was so bad in this country. And so a number of young people kind of looked towards that. So Gordon, who was the young man who Bard considered as his adopted son, he was a really interesting, troubled young man. And Bard had spoiled him. Bard had, I think the young man kind of thought of himself as like a Lindbergh character, right? His spy name was the Aviator, because Bard had paid for flying lessons and Gordon flew and everything. So I think what attracted Gordon, I think, was just the sense of adventure, right, that was going on. And Marjorie, the lady he married, who was this young lady Bard had known since she was 5, and we can talk about that later, I think fell in love with him and kind of got drawn in. And so they were doing espionage in New York City. That's not blowing up bridges or anything. It's kind of documents and photographing documents and putting them on microfiche and sending them to Europe with sailors. I mean, the spy craft is kind of fun, but not the central theme of the book, but it's in there. And so they then got promoted. They were being sent to Paris to run this spy operation in 1933. and were rather quickly rounded up in this great, there was kind of I think they arrested 20-some people who were in this spy network that Gordon was supposed to be running, ineptly, we might add. So there they are, and it's suddenly on the front page of the New York Times. And Gordon, I guess the address he gave was Bard's law office. So all of a sudden, Bard's name is in the front page of the New York Times. And no one quite knew. He was like old family friend, lawyer, etc. But so his devotion to Gordon was such. I mean, Bard took a real risk. I mean, in a sense, then helping them, trying to help solve the problem, and generously using all his connections as much as he could to help them. At that point, he'd lost a lot of his money. So at this point, it was a real sacrifice for him to find the money, go over there, hire lawyers, be there with them on several trips. But Bard was someone who's totally devoted. It's like with his nonprofits. If he got involved with a nonprofit, he was on the board for 40, 30 years, right? I mean, he stuck with things. This was a man that did not like change. Now, not having any official degrees on psychiatry, Bard's early life was full of change. By the time he was 5, his mother had died, his 2 older brothers had died, and his father remarried. So maybe the fact that the rest of his life, everything tried to stay the same. Where he lived, he would live for 10 or 20 years when he was on boards. He was a man that, once he put his feet down on something, he stuck with it.
So, but he finally gets them back to America. Works very hard to get them for the government to let them back and to work out an arrangement where they will talk to the government about being spies.
Yeah, so timing is everything, and their timing was really bad on a regular basis. So they were released after being in their separate jail cells for, I think, 16 months because they cooperated. The system in France, the judge actually investigates the charges. And the judge kind of fell in love with this young American couple. And the only time they could see each other was when the judge had them come to his office to be interviewed, right? And so he made these interesting remarks to the press about, oh, this wonderful young couple, and I bring them together. But anyway, they were let off because they ratted out other members of the spy ring. Now, in reality, and I was able to do an interview with Marjorie, who is the wife of Gordon, when she was 91. And she basically said the judge really went to great lengths to protect them. And basically, she thought that they really didn't tell them about any of the other spies that they didn't know already. But they were allowed out. And so they're released from the 2 separate prisons, and who's there to meet them is Bard. And of course, they're worried that because they've turned on the Soviets, they're worried that their lives might be in danger. They can't come back to the United States because their passports have been pulled. And so they end up going to southern France with Bard, who buys a Ford Cabriolet, and they drive and spend 3 or 4 months in the south of France. Bard then has to come back to normal life. They can't come back to the US because they don't have passports. So they managed to talk their way across Europe. Bard had managed to get them letters from the State Department saying they were Americans. They wouldn't give them passports, but he had enough connections. So they managed to talk their way with these letters through Europe. And they finally settled down in Austria, just as the Nazis arrived. And so one of the book is a blended narrative. It kind of looks at Bard's, what's going on in his private life and what's going on with his public life. So in 1938, he is up in Albany trying to get the Bard Act passed. There's another attempt to do it. He's going up on the train, he's on radio shows. Same time, he's trying to get Gordon and Marjorie back to the United States. But to add to complications, and now it's not just Gordon, and it's not just Marjorie, it's their baby named Albert Bard. So he now has to get his namesake to come back. So he's juggling getting them back. At the same time, he's trying to get this bill he's been working on for decades all together at the same time. So this is a really resilient guy who's managing this kind of intense, unconventional, private life, family business. At the same time, he's doing this civic stuff, and he's still working with all the other nonprofits. So that, to me, that's part of what's, the resilience of this guy is very, it's just remarkable, and I think kind of inspirational. I mean,
And yet there's a third element, and that is his lifelong devotion to his fraternity and fraternal associations.
So Bard, Bard was a true Renaissance man. I mean, he wrote poetry, collected books, I mean, all of what you'd expect. But he was very involved in the Greek fraternity movement, right? In fact, he was more of a star and an iconic figure in the Greek fraternity movement than he's been remembered as a civic leader in New York. So when I'm doing this research on Bard, and I go through those papers in the public library, and I understand that there's these references to this fraternity he's a member of. So I go online, check out Chi Psi fraternity, got a national office, why not? Send them an email, say, look, there's this guy, he was a fraternity brother years ago, you probably don't remember him, but doing some research, do you have anything? Within hours, I get an email back, I write you under a portrait of Albert Bard. No. So he was remembered still to this day. And so he was a Chi Psi fraternity member at Amherst when he was in college. He stayed involved. He became involved with the national organization of Chi Psi, became its president. He helped found a group called the National Interfraternity Conference. He was a founder of it, went to every one of its meetings until he died, and traveled all across the country, both as initially as the president of Chi Psi National, and then as part of this national organization. He traveled across America when it was not comfortable to travel to all of these events for decades. So he had this whole other aspect of his life. And actually, I think most of his social connections, his non-civic social connections, were through the fraternity. And that's ultimately how he met Gordon.
So ultimately, Gordon's wife Marjorie is very helpful to you in researching and getting this book. But you're also very clear in the book that he was almost smothering with them. They moved upstate to be out of the city, and letter after letter, are you taking your vitamins? You know, how are the children? Do you wear a hat in the winter? And it was complicated. He
might be kind of somebody's worst idea of like a mother-in-law, right? You know, he was just, but he was a detail-oriented guy, right? And he was a lawyer. And I have this, so I was able to do an interview with Marjorie when she was 91, okay? And it's because of her that I was able to get correspondence between Bard or actually Bard's letters to them from basically the spy episode until Gordon died. And Bard is a detail guy, and so these letters just go into this detail about, have you done this? Have you changed the tires? What about religion in the kids? You do anything with religion in the kids? And they were living in a cabin upstate, and it was like, well, did you buy that ladder for the second floor window that you throw out in case there's a fire and the kids should come down? And no, it's probably a bad idea for the kids to have like pellet guns, and it's just so intensely focused and committed that I think most people would have found pretty oppressive. On the other hand, Bard was the white knight in their life from almost the beginning of time. I mean, he'd known Marjorie since she was 5. When he met Gordon was, we don't know exactly when they met, but he was 20 or 21. I mean, so Bard was a piece of their lives and really morphed into playing this kind of grandfather role. He became the, de facto grandfather for Gordon and Marjorie's kids. And played a role, this domestic role that the people who knew him in New York through these nonprofit groups and the civic leaders had no idea about that he had this domestic life, right? I mean, for the last several decades, he lived at the widow Switz's house in East Orange, New Jersey. This is
that's Gordon's
This
mother.
is Gordon's mother, who was a widow when Bard met the family. So Bard has a kind of suite of rooms in this house out there and is kind of a member of the family. But in these letters, he'll write about, you know, the pet cat, you know, helping garden in the backyard, you know, shoveling snow. All of these things that his, you know, fellow board members had no idea, you know, and I think they thought that, you know, there was like a lady ran the house, you know, he didn't have any idea that he had a real family life that augmented his fraternity life, which augmented his civic life.
Since he was so involved civically, and since the fraternity managed to remember him, why didn't we?
Well, that's interesting. He, you know, lived to 96. He had the misfortune of dying during the New York Times strike. And so instead of getting the full-page obituary that he would have otherwise gotten, because the New York Times had followed him. When he was 90, there was an article. When he was 95, there was an article and a photograph of him. So, and he'd published, I'm going to say probably close to 100 letters over his life in the New York Times. So he would have, I mean, he was really known to them. But so with the obit, I think that you didn't lift it up kind of for future researchers in a way. And I mean, a lot of the people he'd worked with were dead, though there was a nice, you know, memorial and all sorts of wonderful things said about him by people in the civic world. But I guess New York kind of moved on. At that point also, he was living in East Orange, New Jersey for the last decades of his life. Came into New York every day, almost until his death. And he remained active.
There's no real way to understand what his reaction would be to today, but given the state of civic organizations, given the pushback against preservation at the moment, what would he be doing?
Well, he was, I'm not sure how he would be reacting. He was a great believer in these civic organizations and their importance. In fact, he actually tried to create, you know, he was pushing for, he wrote letters to several philanthropists trying to get them to actually create a building that would have been the home for all these civic organizations. So I think he'd be very much trying to bolster the civic organizations and encourage them. There's a nice quote. I did an interview with two early leaders of the landmarks kind of law in New York, two early landmarks commissioners, and Harmon Goldstone and Jeffrey Platt. And one of them was reminiscing that at one point he had gone to a hearing with Bard. At this point, Bard was well into his 80s. And they'd gone to a hearing down at the Board of Estimate, I think, and had been there all day. You know, and they finally testified at, you know, I don't know, 9 at night. And of course, the board voted the wrong way. And when they were leaving, you know, the younger guy had turned to Bard, but Bard, thinking that Bard was going to be so disappointed about this. And Bard basically said to him something like, "We'll win next time." I mean, so he was just a man who was so, he was committed to these, he was used to being out of sync with the prevalent thinking at the time, right? I mean, the Bard Act, when first drafted in 1913, was decades ahead of thinking, but the thinking caught up with him. So I think, to me, one of the lessons for us is not to limit our thinking about what's doable in terms of, you know, legislation that would support preservation or the things we believe in, because it may not fit now, right? But unless you put an idea out there and then keep pushing it. So I think, to me, that's one of the, he played the long game, as people say. You know, he was in it, he was committed, and he was resilient. I think that both in his personal life and his public life had a lot of disappointments, but he just barreled through and then never gave up.
Well, you kind of barreled through to get this book done, too. So I always find it, if somebody writes one book, I think that's wonderful. If somebody can get 2 out, I am just totally amazed. And what's the best lesson you learned from doing all this?
Well, I mean, I learned a lot about the need for resilience. I mean, Bard was, putting aside the kind of odder aspects of his personal life choices, but his civic engagement and his commitment to a set of values and beliefs, and he was courageous. He was also ornery. I think that helped. But he joked that you could be ornery as long as you had a good sense of humor. And if you wrapped it in humor, you could really say what you needed to be said. So his courage really is something that jumped out at me. I have to say, what I learned as a writer, I'm a accidental author, I'm an accidental archivist. I mean, the books I've written are books whose stories I felt needed to be told, right? And were subjects I had researched so long that if I didn't do a book, I would have been diagnosed as having compulsive, obsessive compulsive disorder, right? Because I was like so focused on them. So I was kind of driven to write books that I felt needed to be, stories that needed to be told. And that's kind of when I discovered that Bard was more than the Bard Act. I felt that this was a man that kind of deserved to be elevated for all sorts of reasons. But one of the things about working on a book for many, many years is at first I would beat myself up because I would go back and look at research I'd done like 5 years earlier and say, why am I going over that again? And then I realized every time I went back over something, what I'd learned in the interim allowed me to find something else in that work that I'd done earlier that hadn't jumped out to me as being important, right? So I quit beating myself up for being so disorganized. I had to keep going back and realized it was actually part of the learning process and really kind of enriched what I got to learn. One of the other takeaways from this is the value of archives. This story could not have been told without the archival material that I was able to access. And I kind of have this wonderful vision that there are archivists kind of sitting out there across the world just waiting for somebody to call and kind of say, Albert Bard? Do you have anything about Albert Bard? Because when I would make those calls, the enthusiasm and the willingness of people to say, yeah, we might have something at the library in Norwich, Connecticut, where he grew up, or the archives at Amherst, where he went to school. The archival journey behind the book was really exciting and rewarding, and I think was a lot of wonderful kismet. I mean, things just one thing led to another archivally.
Great. We have time for questions from the audience.
We certainly do. I'm going to ask, I can see a gentleman there is ready to go. Yes, you, sir. But I'm going to ask if you wait until the mic comes to you. I also want to remind our in-person audience, our online audience, although you may not be here, you too can submit questions if you would contact Meg, our online person, and she will then text your questions to me and I will read them out.
Got two quick questions. One, it seems like what you're talking about Gordon, was he just in for the goodies or was he really in love with him? It seems like it was unrequited.
That's an excellent question. Gordon clearly had feelings for Bard. And their relationship was, as a family was for 25 years, right? And so, frankly, if Gordon was in it just kind of to play this rich old guy, he would have taken the money and run. a lot of there was an emotional connection between them. Clearly, Bard's was more intense. Bard's letters to Gordon are just very, very passionate about how much Gordon means to him, how much he's enriched Bard's life. They're really heartfelt.
Must have been pretty subtle. I don't know. Did the wife know about it?
Yes. So when I interviewed Marjorie, Gordon's wife, when she was 91, I asked her the question. We had done an event. The Archive Project had done an event in New York lifting up Bard, just as we began to kind of give him more visibility. And at the event was Marjorie's daughter, okay? And unbeknownst to me, at that event, somebody went up to her and said, "Did your husband have a homosexual relationship with Albert Bard?" Now that's good cocktail party talk, even for New York, right? That's right. So I'm now up in, out in upstate New York, west of Kingston, at her kitchen table, and she says, "Turn on the mic," and I turned on the tape recorder, and she said, "At that event, somebody asked my daughter whether Gordon and Albert Bard had a homosexual relationship, and the answer is yes, of course." And she said, "You know, I went to Vassar, and I didn't know about anything like that until I went to Vassar, but I went to Vassar, so I knew all about it." Unfortunately, Marjorie died, I think it was 3 or 4 months after my interview with her, so I didn't have an ability to kind of take the question a little
Anyway,
further.
my real question is, this sounds so amazing.
All right.
Is this
can you-
any
this is the last
ideas of-
question?
Yes.
It seems very cinematic. Any movie deals? It seems like it should be a movie.
We'll talk later, if you've got connections. Okay.
Hi. I have a question regarding, the outdoor advertising billboards. I understand that this 1916 zoning regulation already took the billboards out of Fifth Avenue or some places. So I was wondering, partly he achieved it earlier, or?
There were limited controls on billboards in certain areas that evolved through zoning. They had to be in an industrial zone. So Bard found ways to, over time, use zoning to limit billboards in certain areas. But the billboard battle, so Bard in 1923, Bard hooked up with this, that's wrong language in modern terms, he partnered with a wonderful lady named Elizabeth Lawton, who led a national effort, created these national roadside councils all across America of women, mostly women, and many out of the Garden Club movement, fighting billboards across America. Because you have to remember at this time, highways are, happening, and these beautiful highways were being ruined by billboards. So this lady led from 1923 until she died, I think it was 1950, I think she died. She had this national network, and Bard was her legal counsel. I mean, he didn't get paid, but so they were this duo battling billboards, and Bard was the go-to guy. If you wanted to figure out if there was a way to regulate billboards in your state, for instance, Bard was the national expert. So he was talking about billboard regulations with people all across the country who would be writing him and asking for advice. He would follow bills in different states that were trying to limit billboards. So he was very engaged.
Right, do we have another question? Because I have an online question. It's more common. This is from John Toranac,
Oh, yes.
and he wants to draw your attention because obviously the emphasis on high quality of design. He is basically reminding us all about the City Hall, because seemingly in a proto-preservation movement that was headed by Andrew Hoswell Green, Albany signed a law forbidding the removal of City Hall. Yes, the preservation of City Hall was in large part because of the building's high quality of design and historical associations. It was a first in New York City, a fact that generally goes unheralded. Have you anything to add to that?
Well, design, putting that directly in the Bard context, Bard was very into wanting quality design. And in fact, when at the very end, an award was created, the Bard Award, by one of these civic nonprofits that was supposed to be for the best new design building in New York. And the awards got the most public attention the first year when they announced there was no building in New York worthy of the award. But because Bard's interest in quality design, that's why that award was named after him and created. So he was a great believer in the need for quality. But he also had his opinion about architecture. I mean, he was a Beaux-Arts guy. That was kind of where his aesthetics were. He would have hated all the modern high-rises. I mean,
What did you find that was unexpected about Bard?
There's a question
yeah.
there.
I would say I found one thing after another that I
Okay,
didn't expect
okay.
about Bard, from his public life to his private life. It was kind of the interview with Marjorie, where she confirmed the relationship with Gordon and Bard. The next shoe that dropped during that interview was when she said that in 1930s, Bard wasn't as active in his civic work, which I hadn't noticed a diminution in it. And she said, that's because of our problem. It's like, okay. And that's when she talked about being arrested as Soviet spies in 1933. So, two big surprises.
I have a question which I probably already know the answer to after all his activity. But did he have any connection to Bard College? Any familial background or anything?
I haven't found any link to Bard College. Bard's, as they would say, Bard's people came from Connecticut. I haven't found any links between, Bard's father and his kid, the family and his brothers and sisters with Bard College. Be kind of fun if there were.
Do we have any more questions? Okay,
No,
a
back
few over
there.
there. Yep.
When you were going through the stuff at the New York Public Library, what kind of things did you find there? It took you so much time.
Oh, it was terrific. It was scary, but terrific. So the papers, at that time, there was a very, very loose finding aid. So the papers had been given after Bard died. And I don't think anyone had been through them all. So I was untying bundles of paper with strings, and I was looking at papers held together by rusty straight pins. I guess this was pre-paperclip period. And so what was revealing to me was the papers. I couldn't because there was no file in the Bard Act, I just started going box through box of papers. And that's where all these other aspects of his life came up, right? There were all these files from the civic organizations he was involved with. In fact, I was going through his files of work with the Municipal Art Society. He had copies of minutes that weren't even in the Municipal Art Society archives in the microfiche, right? He collected that much stuff. There's a wonderful photo that the New York Times took of Bard about a year before he died, and it was in his office. And he's sitting there, and behind him is kind of one of these kind of library tables piled high with papers. And in back of the table piled high with papers was a row of filing cabinets piled high with papers. And this was actually a reduced version, because Bard had kind of shrunk his office space in the building over time. So it was a wide range of stuff, some family stuff, some stuff about his father that was interesting. But it was a really journey kind of through his life. Most of those papers had been, basically, almost all the private stuff had been taken out of those papers. There were only a few references that kind of made me wonder. There were references to this adopted son. It's like, well, what's that all about, right? And there were references to his medical problems and stuff, which is why I thought there was another story about his life, his private life, and it was actually those papers are what took me to be able to meet Marjorie, an interviewer, when she was 91. Because looking at these papers and realizing at that point that I didn't know that Bard had any family, official or otherwise, like, who donated these papers, right? Why didn't they go into a dumpster, or several dumpsters, or half a dozen dumpsters? And the New York Public Library had the names of the two people who donated those papers to the public library in the 1960s, right? And so now it's 2001 or 2002, and we're sending letters to those people from their addresses in the 1960s, just because you do it, right? We didn't expect to get any answer. And we got a phone call from a neighbor of Marjorie's who was helping her, saying, Marjorie's here, she's happy to talk, she's blind, but she's totally there and eager to talk. So it was actually through those archives at the New York Public that we got to her. And she then gave me a suitcase full of letters that Bard had written to them, which gave me the depth of insight into the domestic and the family life that this guy who was dismissed as his consummate bachelor with nothing else in his life but civic groups or his fraternity had this whole other dimension to his life.
Thank you. I have a question right back here. First of all, your tribute to archives is incredible, and it's really a love story, so thank you for sharing your experience with that. My question is, in your preservationist life, are there any things happening in our city right now that you, as a preservationist, are really just keeping your eyes on or wondering about preservation related?
And this program goes to when? Midnight? Well, I mean, and Peg is on the front lines of what's happening in preservation today in New York. Big battle trying to save West Park Presbyterian Church on the west side. Hardship application going to be really critical, whatever happens there. At the more cosmic level, there's been a continuing devolution of the Landmarks Commission over the last number of years. As it's become more political and as the powers of real estate have gotten to be stronger and stronger. So it's a big effort. You know, we fought hard to get that agency. We're lucky to have it, but it's not the Landmarks Commission I grew up with in the 70s and 80s in New York. So, I mean, we have to fight hard to protect that institution. And we're, you know, so you just, the fight goes on. I mean, I think the moral of the story is, like Bard, you know, he was fighting the battle till he died. So there's no way out if you're a preservationist. You've got to stay in the game.
If I could just add to that, yes. There's a way to improve Penn Station without tearing down the block south with landmark quality buildings and a couple of thousand people who live there in affordable homes. There is a sense when the Landmarks Law was founded, opponents said it's going to freeze the city. They're going to coat the city in amber. You can see how well that worked. I mean, there are parts of Brooklyn and Queens unrecognizable today with new growth. But in this, we're now in an era where housing trumps other issues. So we're now being blamed for a lack of housing production because of all these historic districts. All the districts together take up 5% of the land of New York. They've got 95% to work on, but where they want to build is in Manhattan, where the money is. So, and it's a big, solid push with a lot of money behind it and a lot of influence. And so we're trying to counter that.
Absolutely.
Right, well, we now have the audience mic is back on our hands, so I think we will take this opportunity to round up and ask you to ask your question to Tony and Peg after the conclusion of the program. But I just have a final online question that I might ask you to quickly answer, Tony. This is from Pedro. Thank you for the conversation. I would like to ask, in time when the concept of beauty has been profoundly distorted, how did Albert Bard understand and define beauty? What did beauty truly mean to him? I appreciate that again could keep you here till midnight.
Yeah, I would say the way he operationalized beauty in a way. You know, he was one of the New Yorkers who went to the, Chicago World's Fair and was particularly taken by the beauty of what a city could be, the statuary. He was it's kind of a classicist. I mean, he was kind of had a traditional sense of beauty. And it's one of the questions I asked is why? Why was he so tuned into that? He grew up in a very beautiful town, Norwich, Connecticut. His walk to school every day, it was through what's today a historic district. So I think he was surrounded by beauty. He went to, Amherst, a beautiful place. So I don't know why beauty, kind of was such a thing for him, but it was, and in a very classic sense.
Well, that seems a very fitting note to conclude on. Tony, I just want to thank you so much. You really did. You sang the story of a New York hero, and it was a wonderful conversation. And I also want to thank Peg for leading the conversation so beautifully. We're very grateful to you both, and it really is thanks to you, I think, that Albert Bard lives again contemporarily. So thank you.
He's back on 44th Street.
Yeah.
Tony, thank you so much for telling this story of this man and it was a story that needed to be told. But it's a story. People always look for inspirational things, and here we go. Decades of work, but he had what he produced, such a volume of work. I happen to like the stories he wrote, caring about. It showed he was a caring individual. So beautiful that you brought that to light. I agree with this gentleman. Not so sure about your acting part, but that it would make a wonderful, biography on television. And I can't believe I knew nothing about him. So thank you so much for bringing that to light, really. So, and to Peg and Tony both, we listen to a lot of lectures, and I'm sure everyone does all over town, podcasts. These are two consummate professionals. I just enjoy
Here.
Right.
Yes.
They could talk. They could be taught. It's music to your ears. It could be a subject. And you're two people that have done so much for New York, but do it with eloquence, intelligence, tenacity. I mean, you're the people that anyone would want on their team, so thank you. From this native New Yorker and steward of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen with my colleagues, thank you so much. You are both wonderful. Thank you. Okay.
We just want to remind you that this wonderful book is now available to purchase. Thank you so much for coming. See you in 3 weeks for the Fountains of New York City. Thank you.